I always see lots of familiar faces, so I know a lot of you are regulars, and so thank you for coming. How many of you are Brainstorm's first timers? Okay, great, thank you. My name's Mike Mock. I'm in the Department of Neuroscience here at UT. And so for you first timers, Brainstorms is sponsored by the Department of Neuroscience, and it's just our way of reaching out and trying to connect with the Austin community. And it's born out of the idea that a world-class neuroscience faculty, one of our responsibilities is sharing what we're learning with you. And frankly, we learn quite a bit listening and answering your questions and talking to you. And so, as always, I want to emphasize that we take the word conversation, which is in all of our titles, seriously. And you'll see that tonight, or this afternoon, our speaker we'll talk for a while, then we'll assemble a panel, and where you'll be able to ask questions through your smartphone, and we'll tell you how to do that shortly. And then I want to emphasize that invariably, not all of the questions will be answered. Often, people think of questions on the way home, they smack themselves on the forehead, and so I want to emphasize that one of the other pieces of information that we'll make available later is my email address, and so feel free to email me questions that didn't get answered or ones you thought of. But that's what's in it for us, is we learn a lot contending with and answering your questions, okay? So another fun day. Today we're going to, as you saw from the title, talk about things about the evolution of the brain. And our speaker today, Dr. Aryl Zakon, I think he came to UT during the Jurassic? He's one of our, I'm getting older too. He's one of our most distinguished and accomplished professors here at UT, and he'll do a great job. We have 3 panelists, 2 professors and a graduate student, and we'll introduce them at the time. But just to get things going, and so Harold has a lot of time to talk, please join me in welcoming Dr. Aryl Zakon.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you all for coming today. It's a pleasure to see so many people in this room. So I hope for the next 30 minutes or so, you have fun and learn something. So let me start out with this. That's a sponge. It's classified as an animal. It has no sensory systems. It doesn't move. It has no nervous systems. It basically filters nutrients from the ocean and reproduces. And that's basically what it does. From those humble beginnings, we go to organisms with eyes, noses, ears, tongues, touch receptors that can experience the world around them. Organisms that move around, they have muscles, they have limbs, and they have a brain to regulate all of this, to take sensory information and immediately convert it into movements. They have brains that can learn and remember. And at least as far as we know with human beings, they have brains that can sense all these different modalities, what vision looks like, what sound sounds like. We can experience pain. We experience pleasure. There are so many things we can do. We can imagine, we can think, we can even plan seminars. So for me, one of the great questions in contemporary biology is, how does the brain work, and how did we go from organisms that had no neurons to the evolution of the first neurons to eventually the evolution of the whole nervous system? So I should tell you, I teach a class here at UT Austin, and the title of the class, the topic, is Evolutionary Neurobiology. And so what we talk about is the 600 million years that elapsed during the evolution of the first neurons, roughly 600 million years ago, and some of the key changes in neuronal processing and wiring of circuits, etc. And then we talk in the end of the class about the last 2 million years of the evolution of the human brain. And so, because this is a lot of material, I'm only going to talk about the last 200 million years today. So, the question that I ask my class and try and answer is, what's so special about the human brain? And really, before we answer that question, we have to say, compared with what? Our brain is an animal brain, it's a mammalian brain, it's a primate brain, since we're all primates. But most specifically, our brain is a great ape brain. So let's talk briefly about the great apes. So the great apes, or the hominids, include orangutans, gorillas, a couple of species of chimpanzees, and us. This group all evolved in Africa. Now, the way we know this relationship is if we compare the DNA of each species, we can see chimps' DNA is most similar to ours, gorillas less similar, and orangs even less similar. So these differences in DNA between the different species occur at some sort of regular change during evolution. So if we know the number of differences between two species, we can calculate when in the past those species had a common ancestor. So doing this, we can see that, for example, gorillas and us, that is humans and chimps, had a common ancestor here. Eventually, there was another ape, no longer with us, that was the common ancestor of chimps and humans. And that common ancestor that we had with chimps and humans was about 6 to 7 million years ago, which is a drop in the bucket in terms of evolutionary time. So one major question is, how did all the changes in our brains and other aspects of our physiology occur in this relatively brief period of time? Now, when we consider going from this ancestor to humans, we also have to remember that there are extinct human ancestors that are no longer with us. And in fact, that's true of each of these different groups of animals, extinct ancestors. So let me briefly acquaint you with some of our ancestors. And this is our family tree. And roughly 6-7 million years ago is when it begins, and it ends here in the present. And the way you should read this is from ancestors, different groups evolved, and these groups are known from fossils in Africa. Basically the height, the area, let's say the height of the foliage tells us when they went extinct, and we know that because the fossils that are found in Africa, they're found in beds of rock that we know from various dating methods are so many years old, and then the fossils disappear. We don't see them later, so we can say, well, this group started seeing their fossils here, and then eventually we didn't see any after this time. So there are a couple of groups. You might have heard of Australopithecus, and these different groups are relatives, but they just didn't make it. The ones who made it are our group, Homo, genus Homo. And there are a few different species of Homo. We're Homo sapiens, I'm sure you know. And I'll tell you a little bit about them later. So let's get back to the question, what is special about the human brain? A number of things have been suggested over the years, and I'll just briefly go over a list. Pretty much everyone agrees that we have bigger brains than other primates, and where it's still controversial, but some people think the frontal lobes, which is the site of executive function, it's where we we can delay our behavior for gratification later. It's where we make decisions about the reward potential of things. So many things of, I would say things that maybe kids and teenagers don't have, but finally adults get. Those functions are in the frontal lobe. There are many genes that show evolutionary change, and I'll tell you one story about one in a minute. And in particular, I'll be focusing on neurogenesis, that is the process by which new neurons are generated, because that ties into having a bigger brain. There are reports of novel types of neurons, so-called spindle neurons, rose-hip neurons. Those are neurons that people have seen in human brains, and those are usually brains either from autopsy or from after patients have surgery, say an epileptic, a focus in the brain is taken out. You can study the cells, and by labeling the neurons in certain ways, you can actually see what they look like. So there are different classes or types of neurons that are only seen in the human brain, and people think, well, that may have something to do with evolution, with the novelty of the human brain. There are dendrites, which you know are the structures that synapses are made on, and there are examples of dendrites in the human cortex that are very specific. In fact, some recent work by, oh gosh, Mark, Hitoshi's student, my gosh, I'm just blanking on his last name. That's what happens when you get stage fright. Anyway, from a recent student from our program who's now a professor at MIT did, it's beautiful work. And also it's been suggested that there are more connections between certain kinds of neurons. And I'm not going to go into any detail, but let me just say, most of the work, when we compare things in humans to other animals, means we compare them to rodents, to mice or rats, which is what most neuroscience work is done on. Now, if you're interested in a neuron, how a neuron works, they work pretty much the same from a jellyfish to us. But if you're interested in how a brain works, how it's all connected, and you want to know about humans, you need to look at humans and compare them to great apes. There's a bit of a problem there, and that is, if we look at the great apes, you can see most of them are endangered. And the reason is because we have encroached on their habitat through logging or just cutting the trees down for farming. People go after them for bushmeat. There are many reasons why they're endangered. Plus, it's ethically a bit dubious to do some things on other great apes because we know that they have quite a bit of, let's say, human-like traits. The one thing that we can do, and we'll get back to this, is also look at just brain size in general, because now we can call in the fossils that we have of humans. Okay, I'm just going to tell you one quick story. So this story has to do with that we have more neurons, and I'm going to tell you about one evolutionary change in a gene that is one of the many things that resulted in more neurons. So this is a study published 2 years ago. The main point is this shows a piece of a chromosome, and then that's the middle of the chromosome, and that's more of the chromosome. The chromosome would, run out in both directions. Oh, Mark Harnett, that's his name. Sorry. Anyway, here's the chromosome. Here's a gene called Notch2, and we know that other monkeys and primates and other mammals only have one copy of that gene. But a little piece of this gene ended up in the ancestor of gorillas and chimps and us. And that piece kind of broke. It's still identifiable in the genomes of gorillas and chimps, but it doesn't really do anything. However, through a process I can't get into now, in an ancient human being, it is inferred that that gene was repaired. And furthermore, 2 other copies of that gene occurred in the chromosomes. So living human beings have 3 copies of this gene. And what this gene does is it regulates the number of neurons that are made in the brain from the stem cells in the brain that generate neurons. Now, and this just shows here would be like a low, if you had, like in a rat, if you experimentally altered it, you would have low expression or low numbers of neurons, but with these genes, it ends up making more and more neurons. One way that we know about genes for neurogenesis is they sometimes surface in the clinics. And then, and usually in extreme cases, it can be very small brains that are inviable. Now, here is a case where in humans, in a big clinical study, it was found that there was a deletion of one of these 3 genes so that there are only 2 copies. And those people had microcephaly, smaller heads and smaller brains. The ones that had an extra duplication, this is rare, but actually duplications or deletions of genes or pieces of these genes happen a lot. And no doubt all of us in the audience have a duplication or a deletion of this or that gene or this or that part. So it's not uncommon. Often it won't be bad. So in these cases, there may or may not, depending on circumstances, be intellectual delay or developmental delay. But the main point is by having an extra copy of this gene or one less copy of this gene, it influences the size of the brain. So already we can get an idea about some of the things involved in the evolution of a larger brain in humans. Now, what I want to do is point out that actually, if we look at our evolution, first looking at some of our relatives that are not Homo, our brain's cranium size began increasing. Then once we get to Homo, we see a big increase in brain size. Homo habilis is one of the earliest. We know they're only found in Africa. They made tools. There were no slouches. Someone who's really not a slouch, Homo erectus. Now, how many of you heard about humans evolving in Africa and the out of Africa theory that we then populated the world, right? You're familiar with that. Well, actually, there were multiple events where humans left Africa. Homo erectus skeletal material is found throughout Europe and Asia. They lived on this planet for 1 million years. They were doing pretty well. Eventually, another group of humans left, went to Europe and Asia, and they evolved into Neanderthals. A similar group, very closely related to Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, that's us, left a third time, or for the third time, humans left, and we, as you know, populated Europe, Asia, and the rest of the world, and the other human species went extinct. Now, it's amazing to me, but these days you can take bone or teeth from Neanderthals, and there's still DNA preserved well enough so that there's multiple Neanderthal genomes sequenced. So we know now that they and humans interbred. So there are a lot of interesting questions about that, but I will just say Neanderthals are, if they're not similar to us, I mean, they're very similar to us. We interbred with them. You know, if we dressed one up in human clothes, they nowadays might pass for us. They would look a little different. They have weak chins, whereas a key aspect of humans is our chins, and we have flatter faces. But other than that, they would look a lot like us. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is not so much talk about the some of the selective forces on humans. I'm going to talk about what could possibly have fueled the increase in brain size in people. And there are two hypotheses I want to deal with. The first is the expensive brain hypothesis. And this goes as follows. First of all, in the same way that money is the currency of everything we do, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is the currency of all biological operations. It's what we use to make cells, to power everything we do. So ATP is the energy of biology. So how expensive are our brains? Our brains are 2% of our total mass, but they use 20% of our total energy. Our brains are energy hogs. And if you compare them with chimps or mammalian brains, they use so much more. So here's the theory, the expensive brain hypothesis. So the idea is we eat food. That's where all ATP ultimately comes from, what we eat. We eat food, we make it into energy. That energy can go to our brains or elsewhere. Now, just considering the gut, if we think about other great apes, they mostly eat fruits and leaves, and so the energy would go to our brain, and let's just think about the energy going to our gut. Now, this theory says when humans began eating meat, meat has more calories in it than vegetable matter does, and more protein, and so just by eating more meat, it gave them more energy, and that increase in energy could fuel the brain. Furthermore, because plants have a lot of fiber, a long gut is necessary to digest it, and this theory says the gut size could decrease once people ate meat, and even more energy would go to the brain. So this is the expensive brain hypothesis, which for the moment I'll, by shorthand, call it the meat hypothesis. The second hypothesis by Richard Wrangham is the cooking hypothesis. And this states that because cooking breaks down the food, you save a huge amount of energy from chewing, because most gorillas and chimps spend massive parts of their day foraging and chewing and chewing and chewing heavy fibrous leaves. You could break down the food, and also because it's broken down, it would be easier to digest. So this theory says harnessing fire was the key. And here you can see the idea is when you cook food, you free up more energy, and that can go to your brain. Now, the thing is, these are two different hypotheses. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And furthermore, I would say, as Texans, we need to think about this. Meat plus fire equals barbecue. So I want to show you how barbecue drove the evolution of the human brain. Now, in the future, we can talk about the role of onions, pickles, and white bread, but for now, we're just going to talk about the meat. So great apes eat mostly vegetables and leaves and fruit. And I just had to include the next slide. Here's a mom, and oh, what a cutie pie! Look at that, munching away. Chimps will eat leaves and fruit, but they also will eat meat occasionally. They will grab monkeys, and in fact, they have highly coordinated behavior within a troop to catch monkeys. They prize it, but it's not a major part of their diet. Now, let's talk about where the human story begins. In Africa, it began with climate change, and hopefully the human story won't end with climate change. But during a period, Africa became more arid, and forests dwindled away, and our human ancestors moved out into the savanna. There wasn't much vegetation there, I mean some, but there were animals. Now, of course, we're looking at the ancestors of these animals rather than these, but the point is large animals that could serve as prey. Now, even the earliest humans very quickly became bipedal, and we can talk about this, and there are various reasons why. To look over the grass, for example, but being bipedal, they could begin carrying things, and they underwent a number of anatomical changes. Now, these top changes, which I'll mention, could be explained by either the cooking or the meat hypothesis. That is, we got smaller rib cages and shorter guts, smaller teeth, we didn't have to chew as much, less massive jaw muscles. One thing I'll briefly touch upon is bipedality uncouples walking and breathing. Four-legged animals have to breathe every time they move. We don't have to. It's more convenient for us, but we can breathe out of sync. Also, when we lost body hair and increased the number of sweat glands, we were able to thermoregulate more efficiently. Both of these things help with long endurance running. Humans are amazing athletes, some of the best mammals in terms of endurance running. At any rate, this might have predisposed us to track and run after game and totally exhaust them. So these latter two things have more to do with hunting, but these three things might be more involved with either cooking or meat. Here you can see a reconstructed Australopithecine with a big gut, large rib cage. Humans are smaller. Here's a representative orang gut. Humans are smaller. So we clearly did show a reduction in rib cage and gut. If you look at our jaws compared to some of these other relatives, extinct relatives, this is even Homo habilis, the earliest Homo. Very small jaws, smaller teeth. Now, I just want to talk about one thing here. If you look at the back of a rhesus monkey or gorilla skull, there's a huge place where their chewing muscles attach. Here's a top view. And this, the zygomatic arch, which is the cheekbones, is where the muscle goes through and attaches to the jaw. And look at us. We have much smaller jaw muscles. And one question is, did the retraction of our jaw muscles allow our cranium to expand? How are those things related? Well, I'll just show you one interesting molecular result. So this shows a gene for a muscle protein called myosin. And we have different kinds of myosin in fast muscles that we use for sprinting, in slow muscles that we use for a marathon, but also most mammals have a special myosin for jaw muscles that they use to grip and crunch. And it was shown recently that 2 letters of the nucleotide code for this gene were lost in humans and even in Neanderthals and another human relative called denisovans. But the point is, it's gone. And if you look at the chewing muscles of, say, a rhesus monkey, here's a cross-section of a muscle, and the red is a marker for that protein, that myosin protein. If you look in ours, we have teeny little muscle fibers, muscle cells, so that what happened was a mutation in this gene helped us reduce our muscles. So there we can even point to a genome change, a molecular mutation that was involved in human evolution. So, when did humans first begin to eat meat? Probably it was scavenging, and I think Jessica Thompson, who wrote a paper on this recently, had a very interesting idea. She said it was probably the marrow from large bones and the brains from skulls that could be taken from kills that other carnivores made. And her logic is this. It's other than hyenas that can crush bones, the big cats and other carnivores could not get at that food source. By the time a human could get into a kill and the cats had moved away and it was finally safe, there would just be scraps of meat left. They would probably scavenge that. But if they could get marrow in the large bones, and they could access it without cutting tools, they could crack the bones with a rock. This marrow and brains have fat. Those are very important for brain growth. And interestingly enough, marrow is preserved in the bones like canned food, because the meat that's left is slobbered all over by the animals and bacteria, and it goes bad in a day or two. But if they could drag the big bones back, they had canned food. They had marrow for a few days. So it's an interesting idea. And in fact, at sites where people look at humans initially, there were a lot of big bones, long bones. So yeah, we probably were scavenging initially kills. So I'm going to tell you one thing that we know from parasitology that is very interesting here and speaks to this. This is a tapeworm. Now you would think if we have the same, you would think we would have the same tapeworms as chimps, more or less, because they're our closest relatives. But if you take the DNA from different tapeworms and ask which ones are the human ones closest to, you find here in yellow is a human tapeworm, and its closest relatives here in black, the ones they're genetically closest to, are from hyenas. And these two tapeworms, again, yellow is human, their closest relatives in orange are felids, are cats. So we share, we probably got tapeworms from hyenas and cats in Africa while scavenging for food. That's the best explanation for how this could have happened. So if you look at bones that were found 2 million years ago, here are bones that are cracked in a way that they look like a rock could have hit it. No sharp tools. All it took was a rock. So for millions of years, marrow has been a delicacy, and in fact, it's still trendy. If you look at bones, you can see here where there are cut marks. So clearly, for 2 million years, humans have been cutting off meat. Okay, so we can imagine a scenario where as humans got better and better at hunting game, it improved their social organization, and that fed back on their ability to hunt more and more. I will just say one last thing about hunting, and that is a recent paper showed that the number of large carnivores in Africa, the extinction rate went way up. And the only thing they could correlate this with was not weather, not water, not any climate change, but human evolution, the brain size. So the thinking is humans eventually could have become such fierce hunters that they outcompeted some of the carnivores. At any rate, I just want to move on now to the cooking hypothesis. So less energy to digest food. Also, cooking food kills bacteria. That could be a good thing. So when did humans harness fire? That's a more difficult topic, and I'll just show you the best evidence for it. 1 million years ago, which would mean we don't know which humans, it could have been Homo erectus, but some human in Africa 1 million years ago clearly used fire. And the reason we know that is this is looking into a cave, the depths of a cave at different sites. Tools were found, and burnt bones were found, and they had a chemical composition that could tell people that they had to be heated to more than 400 degrees. So those were the only temperatures you get from a hot fire, not from a grass brush fire. So deep in a cave with tools, humans were using fire. Now, this is the last kind of point that I want to make, and then I'll wrap everything up. It's a little complicated, but I find this so interesting, I just wanted to tell you. Now, have you heard that cooking with charcoal, especially broiling red meat over charcoal, it can be dangerous, can be, produce carcinogens? Well, we know that when the meat cooks, it drops fat into the fire, and those make various chemicals, let's say hydrocarbons. And when you breathe those in, those hydrocarbons are not themselves carcinogens, but we have an enzyme that does something else completely, but that enzyme makes them into carcinogenic chemicals. So what's very interesting is, in this study, people looked at this molecular sequence of this gene that converts, it's called the Aryl hydrocarbon receptor. The name doesn't matter, but this is an enzyme, and this enzyme, is the one that makes these hydrocarbons into carcinogens. And it turns out, because Neanderthal genomes are sequenced, and we know what the sequence is like in this, and we can compare the sequence of this gene in a monkey, in a chimp, in Neanderthals, and in all of them they have the same sequence. Humans have a single letter, a single amino acid in the protein that's different. Only humans. So this study then went on to ask, what is the enzymatic activity of this protein like? And we can actually make a Neanderthal version synthetically and ask, what is the enzymatic activity of this protein like? And I know this looks a little complicated, but I'll just walk you through it. What this is showing is, if you add these hydrocarbons and put it in with the enzyme, you get so much of the carcinogenic material if you use the human enzyme. If you make the Neanderthal version, you can see it makes a huge amount of this genetic of material that causes mutations. You can now go in and take the human version and add the single amino acid, swap it out with gene engineering until that's all you do. And when you make the human version, like a Neanderthal, it makes it able to make much more of the carcinogens. And you can do the opposite. A Neanderthal version that's humanized with the human variant makes much less. So this is really interesting because it suggests it's an adaptation that only human Homo sapiens have, and it would have made them far more resistant, far less susceptible to the carcinogens of cooking meat, and especially in an enclosed cave-like environment. So again, we don't know, but maybe that's one of the reasons that Neanderthals died out. Maybe they all got cancer, and we didn't. Anyway, I just want to finish with this and say this is the general thinking. Meat, fire, barbecue, you decide. So what I did today was tell you that the nervous system is 600 million years old. I told you about some of the factors driving the evolution of the human brain in the last 2 million years. And I will say, if you like this, come back next year, and I'll tell you what happened in the first 598 million years. So I just want to give thanks to the National Science Foundation that's been funding my research. None of this was my research. And to the University of Texas, and to you for being here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to assemble our panel, and I'll offer a few instructions, but while we're doing this, killing a little time, this is Elena Silva, and she's the person who puts all this together, and in fact, she and 2 of our people in the Department of Neuroscience won an award this year for outreach. So thanks to, yeah. Thanks to Elena and Laura and Alma, we can now say the award-winning UT Brainstorms. So thanks for that. So while they're fussing with this, let me introduce our panel. And they're going to, along with Harold, they're going to help answer the questions. So this is Sylvie Van Gauk, sorry. She's a graduate student in anthropology. And this is, in the middle, this is Dr. Steve Phelps. He's in the Department of Integrative Biology. And on the end is Dr. Max Snodderly. He's a professor in the Department of Neuroscience. So we've got a nice broad panel for you along with Harold. Now, when this starts to happen, so somebody just raise your hand, let's ask a question, and let's just start the old-fashioned way. Please, thank you for saving us.
Yeah, sure. So I thought that human beings were a fixed species. Fixed.
Okay, so the question is you thought that human beings were a fixed species.
Right.
And you don't mean like came home from the vet. You mean...
Fixed meaning that we are not, although we are closely related to, our chimpanzees and all those, but we are in fact a fixed species.
Okay, can somebody comment on that, please?
So one of the complications in biology is there are a lot of definitions of species, and I think probably the one that you're thinking of is the idea that a species is something defined by its inability to breed with another species. And so famously, a donkey and a horse can interbreed, but the mules that are produced are sterile, so they're considered separate species. In reality, that definition's pretty messy. Because a lot of things may or may not be able to interbreed in nature. That maybe they don't naturally interbreed, but if you bring them into the lab or something, they can. And it's more complicated when we look at fossils because we don't know, right? We're just guessing based on what we see in the fossil record about whether we think they're different enough not to have been able to interbreed. And so the idea that we would be a distinct species from Neanderthals is a long paleontological tradition. But it's only been since we've been able to sequence the DNA of Neanderthals that it's become clear that actually we can interbreed with them, and did. And so if you use 23andMe or a variety of other genome tools, you can see what fraction of your genome is inherited from Neanderthals. And for most people with origin outside of Africa, the percentage is between 2 and 3% of your genome. As we look more closely, we find more. As we look more closely, we find more and more examples of extinct species whose genomes linger on in living people today.
Okay, panelists, good news. We're back to plan A. So I'll read the questions and you guys jump in. So I hope the answer is skull. Which came first, larger brain or larger skull? It's a chicken and egg question.
Yeah. Well, I honestly don't know. I have to just preface this by saying this isn't really my area of research. It's something I find interesting, so I researched it. I teach it in my class. So I'm not an expert on this. But it seems to me that when you just look at those kids that had micro or macrocephaly, or you look at even more extreme cases, you see where the brain is the target of the problem. The skull seems to shape appropriately. So my guess is that the brain is, to a first approximation, regulating the size of the skull. I'm sure it's more complicated than that.
Okay. Is there an evolutionary theory on how autism has developed in the human brain?
I don't have an answer to that particular one, but I just would like to say that there's more than one human brain. And one of the things that people now refer to is neurodiversity. And autism fits into that as many other things do. And we shouldn't forget that evolution is not over. We are sitting here watching it now. And the question of what survives is not only a matter of what the genetics are, but what's the environment, and what is the, in humans particularly, what is the social structure. So I don't know that anybody has an evolutionary theory for this, but we have to consider that changes in the brain are happening all the time. Natural selection is operating on them, and natural selection includes the social circumstances of this very social species that we're part of.
So I agree. The whole notion of diversity is really hugely important in how we think about the brain and its function. I know of two evolutionary ideas about the origins of autism. One is that there's an idea by Bernard Crespi and another fellow named Badcock is his last name. I can't remember his first name. And they think that autism and schizophrenia define a spectrum of human variation that all of us lie along, with autism being one end of the spectrum, which favors traits that are good at systematically tackling problems, and schizophrenia being another end of the spectrum, which really focuses on social cues. I think that theory has not largely been borne out by data because it predicts that the two should be very genetically correlated, and they're not. Another theory, though, is that autism emerges from an excess of mutations related to high levels of brain plasticity, high levels of the ability to make new connections. And that's really interesting because those things, at the right dose might be part of our intelligence, and an excessive dose might be more problematic. And so that's that's still a viable idea about the origins of autism. But of course, we know also that autism lies on a spectrum with people grading from different levels of function there that whose boundaries, well, let me just say that autism lies on the spectrum, and exactly where the boundary is between what we value and what we don't is really more of a social construct than a medical one, although that's not really the question. So I'll shut up.
So next question is there Neanderthal genes in human genome?
That is absolutely true. I think from research it shows that, especially in people with a European ancestry, you have about 4 to 6% Neanderthal DNA.
Which 4 or 6?
That's a great question.
One of my favorite stories about the intersection of the Neanderthal and the human genome is that there are these caves in Romania. And people found these skulls there. When they looked at the skulls, they looked a little weird because they were kind of in between a human skull and Neanderthal skull. And so that was known in the fossil literature and was strange. And then a few years ago, someone got DNA from a jawbone from the same cave. And they found that not only was it a hybrid of a Neanderthal and a human, but based on how long the tracks were of Neanderthal DNA and human DNA, they could tell that it was only a hybrid. It was like the great-grandchild of a hybridization event. So they could actually date to exactly when the hybridization event happened. And all this suggests that the hybridization must have been really common for us to be able to detect it in the fossil record, as spotty as it was.
So if Homo sapiens survives long enough, could there be a new branch of Homo super sapiens? Sounds like a movie.
Well, okay, I'll grab this one. Like Max said, evolution is ongoing. we've complicated things in a way because I, for example, need to wear glasses. I would have been dead a long time ago. You know, there's so many diseases or frailties, let's say, that we have that we are able to correct, so that a major part of evolution on humans now is what we do, what we consciously do. So that is, I think, a very new thing. Nevertheless, natural selection will continue despite that. Climate change could do something, you know, nuclear war could do something. All of these things could impact us on where we go in the future. Now, so no doubt, if we survive, there will be some kind of Homo sapiens in the future. But whether it's a super sapiens, I'm not exactly sure what that means.
Well, actually, that's part of the point. That well, let's say traditionally one speaks of fitness as the judge of evolution. That whichever organisms and species are most fit are the ones that survive. So you have to develop your criterion. Well, what's going to be fit, and that will decide what happens.
Okay. As more humans become vegetarian,
I do want to take this one.
okay, can I just say, whoever picks the question answers the question. So jump in there, folks.
But then I will say, I would like, well, anyone else to chime in, but I know Max is also, you have an appointment in nutrition, don't you?
I do, yes.
Yeah, so he maybe knows more about this than I do, but I've never been stopped about speaking about something that someone else knows more than I do about. But at any rate, don't worry. I was going to say in my talk, vegetarians, relax. These are the events that happened, you know, presumably, we speculate, a long time ago when food was scarce. We have an unprecedented amount of high-quality food today, so that, yes, you can be a vegetarian, and in fact, there are a lot of benefits that come from that. So it doesn't mean that you need to eat meat, or specifically red meat nowadays. It really is more about what happened in the past when food was very, very scarce. Do you want to say anything else?
Well, actually, one of the unique things about the brain, when I was a graduate student and I was about to take my qualifying exam, I was being examined by a very distinguished biochemist who won the Nobel Prize. His name is Christian de Duve. And he started out the exam for 20 minutes questioning me about lipids, fats. So we've talked a lot here about protein, but in fact, the brain is a very fatty organ. And that's why you hear so much about omega-3s and all that stuff, because there are essential fatty acids that we can't synthesize. And so the whole sort of picture of nutrition is one of balance. And if you can get the right nutrients, whatever way you get them, then you're fine. And since we have such abundant agriculture now, there are sources for almost anything that you can think of. But proteins are not the whole story. And in fact, the right fats are one of the things that makes the brain function. And even now, in treating mental illness, there's a very strong emphasis on proper lipid nutrition for people who have these difficulties.
So, how is it that more neurons are better, and why are elephants not smarter than we are?
Anyone?
Are they not? Do we know that? Elephants are very smart.
Well, I'll just say that's an excellent question. And beside elephants, one might also talk about dolphins and whales that have larger brains than we do. I very specifically limited my discussion to great apes. And the reason is that brain structure can vary a lot across different species. And so one of my favorite researchers in this area, Susana Herculano Hausel, who's originally Brazilian, has done some very good work actually counting the number of neurons in the brains of different species. And one of her conclusions was that you can't automatically assume that neurons are going to be similar across species. So her point was, if you take rodents and you look at rodent brains and then scale up from a mouse to a capybara, which is a big South American rodent with a larger brain, actually the neuron sizes get a little bit bigger. So even though the brains as a whole get bigger, they may not have that many more neurons. So this is why she said we need to just look at our closest relatives. And the human brain is a typical primate brain, except a big one. And she said, as far as elephants or whales and dolphins, we need to look at them and count the numbers of neurons, et cetera, et cetera. So they really, part of this is that they have to be looked at in their own context. And the other thing is there are likely to be other changes that I really didn't get to talk about that happened in humans, and we don't know if those same changes or different kinds of changes have occurred in these other species. Nevertheless, I think no one would deny that elephants and cetaceans are pretty darn smart.
Well, one difficulty in just measuring the size of the brain outside of the issue of the number of neurons or the density or size of the neurons is also just that a larger body needs more neurons, right? And so if you look at how the brain size increases with body size, it increases in a pretty regular fashion. And the thought is that that's because, if you're a whale, or maybe not a whale, let's say an elephant, it's easier to imagine. If you're an elephant and you're moving around in space, the space that you're moving around in is a lot larger. The body that you're controlling with fine precision is a lot larger. And just keeping track of all those things requires a larger brain. That doesn't make you smarter, it just means that you have a bigger map that you're working with. And so when we think about brain size, we often take that sort of relationship between brain size and body size into account. And when we do that, humans still have very large brains, even after you account for our relatively large body sizes. So, Harold, I don't recall if cetaceans or elephants are especially big-brained for their body size, are they?
Not for their body size. I will just say that Susanna, who I just mentioned, takes issue with the idea of the brain-body size concept, and that's something Steve and I can duke out later, but I don't think we need to discuss it right now.
Okay, can somebody talk more about the neuron types that are unique to humans?
Well, I guess I can say a little. So the spindle neurons that I mentioned, there was a lot of excitement about those. They were first discovered 20 or 30 years ago, and they're called that because of their shape. They're long and spindly, and people first saw them in frontal cortical areas of humans, and then they said, wow, there's this neuron that we think is unique to humans. And in fact, they carefully looked at other great apes, I believe, chimps, gorillas, and they didn't see so many. There were more than other monkeys, and they didn't see them in rodents. So they said, yes, this is a special kind of neuron. Then somebody found them in dolphins and said, this kind of neuron must have something to do with the evolution of intelligence, because it's only found in cetaceans, dolphins and whales, and highly abundant in humans. And then somebody else began looking at different species of mammals, and the story started falling apart a little bit because there are some species that had more than they would have expected. So honestly, at this point, it's not really clear either what those neurons do or whether they really are specific to humans. And I would say any neuron that's said to be specific to humans, usually, because most people work on mice, means mice don't have it. That's not the same thing as this is unique to humans. So a lot more work has to be done to make this claim.
In the lecture, you mentioned two theories for brain's evolution from our earlier ancestors. Are these the prevailing theories, and what is another prevailing theory?
Well, let me just say one thing. These were two theories for how the brain obtained the energy needed to increase in size. But I know Steve knows a lot about some of the other theories, so I think he should take this question.
All right. Thanks, Harold. So, my work is really interested in social cognition and social behavior and its relationship to the brain. And so that is one of the major other kinds of theories about the evolution of brain size, which is that if you look across animal groups, animals with larger social groups tend to have larger brains. And one of my favorites, and then those larger brains also tend to be associated with increases in cognitive complexity or cognitive plasticity. And so birds that do well in cities tend to be a little bit smarter on average than relatives that don't do well in cities, with the idea that cities are kind of this weird, novel environment that they have to be clever to live in. So yeah, one of my favorite bits of work is work that goes to the literature and looks for reports of deception in primates. And the design of these studies is really cool. What they did is they just, there's lots of reports that scientists may publish that are kind of anecdotal descriptions of behavior they observe. That's an interesting resource that we have in literature. And so these researchers went to these reports and they tried to control for the amount of times people spent watching a particular species. And when they did all this math, what they found was that if you looked at the rates of reports of deception in primates, how often a primate did something that was in its own interests and at the expense of somebody else, that was correlated with the size of the brain in that species. And the overall idea is that the evolution of brain size with large groups and with strategic thinking is very much wed to our social complexity.
The Homo sapiens skull looked smaller than the Neanderthal skull. Are our brains smaller? If yes, how did we dominate?
Sure. I think on average Neanderthals were sometimes a little bit larger in stature than Homo sapiens. That means that overall their brain size is going to be a little bit bigger. As far as I know, it's not relatively larger than the human's brain.
I think they're maybe larger on average, but the ranges overlap quite a bit.
Yeah.
So how did we dominate? We didn't get cancer, right?
Well,
okay, so
yeah, I'll just say one thing very briefly. There are many other factors that are involved, like the carcinogen thing I mentioned isn't particularly neural, but that could have outcompeted it. There are theories that Homo sapiens had larger populations and either slaughtered the Neanderthals or just peacefully interbred with them, and then they kind of became part of our population. So a lot of theories, and we don't really know.
When we first came out of Africa and into the Middle East, we encountered Neanderthals, but we didn't persist. Like that initial out of Africa wave went extinct of humans. So we were presumably outcompeted by Neanderthals earlier in our history. And then when we came out a second time, our culture was a lot more advanced. And one idea is that we had more slender bodies. Neanderthals have really stout bodies with lots of breaks in their bones, and the thought is that they were hunting their prey at relatively close quarters, and it was kind of a brutal lifestyle. And we had, invented these spear throwers and other things, and were more sophisticated in our hunting. At least that's the idea. And so we may simply have outcompeted them by needing less energy for our bodies, by being more effective at catching prey, and that's something that came about as a function of our culture, rather than, simply our brains, I suppose.
Okay, so you mentioned that neurons are conserved. What's the evolution of the neuron like, and can you tell us about the first neurons?
Yeah, so as far as we know, I told you sponges don't have neurons, but some of the other animals that are considered evolved during about the same time, like jellyfish, have neurons. And those neurons that they have essentially all the cellular machinery to make some of the same neurotransmitters that our neurons use. And they have some of the proteins in the membrane that are more like what I study, that make electrical activity in the cells. And those are very similar to the ones we have. So we imagine that cells that had some of these proteins in them, so I'll just give you one brief example. Many of the things that neurons use are ancient. They come even before neurons. Bacteria evolved the first ion channels, and that's what I study, these proteins that make electrical activity. So they were there. The processes that release neurotransmitter, those are found in all cells doing something else. So what happened at the origin of neurons was likely that cellular and molecular processes that were already there in one form or other kind of all came together in this new cell called a neuron, and it worked really well, was selected for, and then eventually, we have nervous systems. A little more complicated than that, but that's a good beginning.
Given our knowledge of genes that affect neuron growth, is it possible using current or near future technology to influence this? Thinking of flowers for Algernon.
Yeah.
That goes back a ways.
Yeah.
So flowers for Algernon, if you guys don't know, if you're too young, that sometimes happens to me now, is a story about scientists intervening with this mouse and making this mouse, or maybe it was a rat, I don't recall, a genius. And I actually clicked on this question because, as Harold knows, he alluded to some of these studies with Notch. And there's actually a whole series of different studies that look at the rate of evolution of parts of our DNA, and they compare it to other apes. And they look for things that evolved unusually quickly in the recent ancestor of humans. And the idea is those little pieces of our genomes that are evolving really quickly, unusually quickly, probably were things under selection, and that's why they evolved so quickly. And what's so cool about it that speaks to this question is that researchers are, because we have a lot of shared heritage with other mammals, including rodents, you can take pieces of that DNA and put them into lab mice in the same spots, and you can actually get like a larger cortex or other kinds of things in a lab mouse. Showing some causal relationship between these things happening in our genome and things that happened in our brains deeper in history. Now, to my knowledge, none of those interventions, though, have actually shown a change in learning, in the ability to learn or anything like that.
Did tool making allow humans to get the means for larger brains, or did the growth of the brains allow for more tools?
Sylvie, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both in there. So the first evidence for tools dates back to about 3.4 million years ago, which is quite a while before the brain size started to increase. I do think over time, as you get a bigger brain, you can develop different types of tools. So initially, when there was first evidence of tool use, you would see some slight marks, cut marks on the bone. But over time, you would see a more complex combination of not just using stone tools, but using bone or wood to create different types of tools. So I think tool use was present well before brain size increased, but as brain size increased and you can think more in a more complex way about your environment and about the process of hunting or scavenging, you will also end up developing more complex types of tools.
Sylvie, do other primates use tools?
Oh, absolutely, yes. Some of the chimpanzees are known to use tools. It's interesting to think about the fact, for example, that the oldest tools date back to 3.4 million years ago, but those are all stone tools. The first time we saw another primate use a tool was when Jane Goodall discovered that chimpanzees were using twigs to poke around in ant mounds and get the ants on the stick and then eat them off. Sticks like that, or grasses or other stuff that might have been used as tools, they don't really fossilize over time. So when we say that 3.4 million years is the first evidence of tool use, of course doesn't mean that that's the first time tools were used. They might have been used long, long before that, but that wouldn't preserve. So we wouldn't ever find any evidence of that.
You don't have to go to the Great Apes to see tool use either. There's fascinating cebus monkeys, who are the organ grinder monkeys that are trained to be helpers for people, systematically use anvils, which are flat stones. They put a coconut on it and pound it with a stone until they open it up. And this is a cultural tool use that's passed along in a primate group that we don't consider to be the part of the apes. So it's something that can evolve independently on in many different pathways. It's all part of a process. Oh, okay.
We need the panelists to click some more questions. We're running out of questions.
I'd like to answer an unasked question, which is, we talk about increase in brain size, but we should actually be more specific about what's changing. One of my favorite examples is there is a very small collection of cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus that sits right above the optic nerve, and it's the master clock for the body. And if I remember correctly, it's a fraction of a millimeter. And this does not have to change size in order to carry out the same function across species. So when people ask, what is it that increases with intelligence, they begin to ask more specific questions about parts of the brain that have different types of functions. And for example, the skull doesn't just increase in size as we see humans progressing, but the frontal cortex and the frontal part of the skull disproportionately gets larger. And this is part of the brain that we think is involved in decision making and executive function. So those are other things to think about in terms of trying to explain how particular capacities improved as well.
Cooked meat provides more energy, but why not put the extra energy into brawn for competing with carnivores or making humans leaner rather than bigger brained?
Okay, well, I think the idea is that each species is going to have its own, let's say, ways of behaving and its own evolutionary pressures. So, for example, if you look at gorillas, they're huge. They put a lot of their energy into their body, much less, into their brains they put it into their body. And that may be because of competition between males for females. Humans, in some way, and this might be something the others can, maybe especially Steve, talk about in terms of social organization, we got smaller. Our canines, which are often used for social contact, like fighting each other, got smaller. So there were probably a lot of our avenue was to have selection on our brains, and that was probably what we did, whereas other primates had other selective forces. And I would just say that if those are the most important ones, like duking it out or other things, then the brains might not have been getting the energy. It was whatever was most important that made you the most fit to leave the most offspring was what evolution was working on.
Yeah, I would just say, evolution really works on what you've got, right? And so this idea that we were scavenging and using simple tools to break open bones kind of makes a lot of sense, and is something that you could elaborate on and make more sophisticated tools. But imagine what it would involve to take something that's a primate and make it a competitor for a hyena or a lion, right? So I think we were prey for some of these species, and I think it would be very difficult to make a minor modification of our body plan that would allow us to actually compete with a species like that. Instead, a minor modification maybe of our brains to make us more sophisticated or use tools better might give us a different niche to fill and a different way to compete with them.
So what do studies say about the teen brain development, past, present, and future?
Take that.
All right, so I'm going to take this one. So, one of the fascinating things, Harold alluded to this in his talk, is the sort of immaturity of the teen brain, which often we think about as, as a brain that's just not quite done yet. But I think that's maybe not exactly the right way to think about it. I think the teen brain is its own special kind of life history stage with its own unique behavioral functions. And to illustrate, what made me think this was that I study unusual species of rodents, and I had collected some singing mice in Costa Rica, and I kept some in my house. I wasn't supposed to do that, but I did. This is a long time ago. I think the statute of limitations is done. And so anyway, so I kept this pair in my house, and I had a little terrarium for them. They had pups, and then these little singing mice. They're really cute. Kind of grew up, and then right around the time when they would be going through puberty, this young mouse was just berserk. Like, it could not get out of that terrarium fast enough. It was running around trying to find its way out. And for me, a sort of light went off that, adolescence is a time in our natural history where we disperse, where we move on to other groups. And it's really common in lots of mammalian species for that to happen. And I think a lot of the risk-taking and other aspects of the teenage brain and the hypersocial aspects of being a teenager are all kind of like part of our life history strategy. I don't think they're maladaptive at all. I think they're designed to do what they are. They just make the rest of us crazy. And so
Yes, they do.
And so increasingly, I do see behavioral neuroscientists thinking about adolescence and using rodent models to study the developing brain in kind of this more functional framework. But yeah, that's my take.
Front row question.
About the frontal lobe, isn't the frontal lobe not fully developed until age 25?
I know changes in the...
Steve, can you repeat the question?
Is the frontal lobe developed during adolescence? And it's true that the frontal lobe is sort of remodeling, and it's important for planning and for impulse control and those kinds of things. But when you're figuring out what place you're going to have in the world, it might make sense to hold that off until you're actually doing what it is you're supposed to be doing.
So what about organisms that have very few neurons? What are they doing?
I guess I'll take that. Many of these organisms have very simple behaviors. So, for example, jellyfish swim around and they catch prey with actually a very, very sophisticated system where they have little stingers and they've evolved proteins as venom. You probably know if you get stung by some jellyfish, it's very painful. And so they don't need many neurons, but their whole livelihood is in terms of capturing prey and eating them. I would say, I would even ask, why do we need to have nervous systems? Why do we need even to be multicellular organisms? Bacteria, who have been around for about 3.5 to 4 billion years, do very well. And they just divide and keep reproducing. And all evolution really works on is, can you leave your DNA? Can you be fit? So in some ways, it's a mystery even why we have complex, and there are reasons probably why multicellularity evolved as opposed to being little single cells. But really, most organisms' nervous systems are fine for what they do, and if they have a simple nervous system, they just basically have simple behaviors, and they do what they need to do. Although I will say, animals like insects, which have much smaller brains than we do, can do some pretty incredible things. Bees, ants have amazing capacities in terms of navigating and finding resources. So I'll just leave it at that. But the brains that we have, each species has, pretty much do what it needs to do for their lifestyle.
Okay, last question for the day. Can you grow more neurons? And by you, we mean us.
Steve, you want to?
Sure. So yes, but only some. So for a long time, we thought that neurons didn't proliferate at all in adulthood in mammals, and they do in some other species. But now we know there's at least one population that migrates out of the lining of a hollow space in your brain. It migrates out into a memory region called the hippocampus, and also into your olfactory bulbs. But those are kind of, as far as I know, really the only new neurons that are really being born. And then I think there's some reports of them going occasionally to other brain regions. So there are new neurons that happen that get born in adulthood, but there are a small fraction of your total neurons, and they're only in a couple brain regions.
Great. Okay, we're out of time, so let's thank Sylvie, Steve, Max, and Harold for a great... One more time, if you have questions that didn't get answered or pop up later, you can go to utbrainstorms.com. You find my email address there and send them to me. And if I don't know the answer, I'll find somebody who does. And then the last thing I'd like to say, besides thank you for being here, is when you come back, bring a friend next time, because we found that's the way we grow, is that people bring buddies next time. So hope to see you again, and hope to see some buddies with you as well. So drive safe.